As parents, we all naturally want the best for our children, and we are typically concerned with their future security when our influence in their lives has waned and they assume independent control. In the context of contemporary society, financial security dominates the great majority of people's concerns. This leads to the necessity of ensuring our children's opportunity for financial comfort and success. In today's world, the obvious way to accomplish this is by providing education, which will ostensibly give them the tools for obtaining that security that we so much desire for them. We then turn to the institutions of education prevalent today, where there is a choice of private and public schools. With our kids' future in mind, we then give them over to teachers who are either directly agents of government or indirectly agents through government certification. For 12 highly formative, impressionable years, we trust our children to strangers who perform curricula which they themselves have not designed, nor have we had any influence in its guidelines. Do we really know what education our children are receiving? Do we really know if it's bringing out our children's full potential, or even if it intends to? It's a massive commitment to trust your children to strangers representing institutions. These are questions that we should be capable of answering with utter conviction before we even consider giving them over. Are we aware of the origin of modern schooling and the purpose it was created for? Was it not instituted, mandated, made compulsory for the benevolent purpose of educating? Again, these are questions that should be answerable. What is the underlying philosophy that modern education is predicated upon? Would you still give your children's malleable years over to strangers if their philosophy was grossly contradictory to your own? These are questions in which the answers have to be known. Otherwise, you are ignorantly and blindly trusting your children to government, so-called experts, and the powers that be. This documentary will attempt to answer these questions. To understand the current predicament of education in America, we first need to revise the history of its origin and roots. In pre-Civil War America, the vast majority of education, excluding the sparse common schools in New England, which were created by the Puritans for the purpose of inculcating religious doctrine, was completely decentralized and on a laissez-faire basis with negligible government influence. Students and parents volunteered for the kind of education that they deemed desirable, with copious options ranging from family schools, small private schools, religious schools, craft schools, farm schools, common schools, grammar schools, homeschooling, or even self-education. In his book, The Underground History of American Education, John Taylor Gatto writes, "Looking back, Abundant data exists from states like Connecticut and Massachusetts to show that by 1840, the incidence of complex literacy in the United States was between 93 and 100%. According to the Connecticut Consensus of 1840, only one citizen out of every 579 was illiterate. And an article in the Journal of Education of 1828 gave this accounting of American literacy. Our population is 12 million. For meeting the intellectual wants of this 12 million, we have about 600 newspapers and periodical journals. There is no country, it is often said, where the means of intelligence are so generally enjoyed by all ranks and where knowledge is so generally diffused among the lower orders of the community as in our own. The fact of the matter is that the advent of public schooling was not the cause of an educated America, that before the introduction of government schooling and compulsory laws, ordinary Americans were highly literate and highly educated. And of the 117 men who signed the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution, 1 out of 3 had only a few months of formal schooling, and only 1 in 4 had gone to college. It is therefore not surprising that the United States Constitution made no mention of education in its provisions. Its framers left education to the volition of the individuals. It was principally in Boston where a system of government schools received popular support, which can be understood by the emergence of Unitarianism. Unitarianism postulated that education was the panacea to eradicate evil because the creation of an institution to improve the character of man could eliminate ignorance, which in turn would eliminate poverty, which then would eliminate social injustice, and then finally, abolish all crime. However, they concluded that only a government system of education could undertake this ostensibly beneficent task. For private schools were administered by individuals who might have entirely different views concerning the nature of man, and were forced by economic reality to concentrate solely on teaching skills rather than molding the children's character. Early Americans were obstinately antithetical to government intrusion in their affairs, and the idea of a centralized, government-provided education was understood to be a clear threat to their recently obtained liberty. However, serendipitously for the Unitarians and public school advocates, contemporaneous developments in Europe during the early 19th century conveniently created a political climate conducive to the course of action the Unitarians were to pursue. The emergence of nationalism during the 19th century allowed the concept of a national system of education to become a widely accepted tenet of statist policy. In 1806, Holland became the first country to create a national system of public education. And in 1819, the Prussians followed suit, adopting a centralized state system that was to become the very model the Unitarians would espouse to implement in America. Meanwhile, during the emergence of nationalism in Europe, an Englishman named Robert Owen began publishing his provocative ideas on social reform. He would later become known as the father of modern socialism. Owen came to public prominence through his unconventional administration of the spinning mills in New Lanark, Scotland, where he established a community for his workers and their families that provided conditions idyllic for their time. However, perhaps the most notable provision was Owen's construction of his school, called the Institute for the Formation of Character, and a subsequent infant school established a year later. Like the Unitarians, he had radical ideas on how to improve the human race, and again like the Unitarians, it necessitated schooling the children.
He felt you could actually mold human character, and he in fact said it is of all truths the most important that man's character is made for, not by himself. So he's an environmental determinist, and he believes that if you can begin virtually at birth and have this child in a superior environment, then you will, through education and liberation of this person's intellect and spirit, you will actually produce a perfect character.
From his premise of environmental determination, he extrapolated that the ramifications of capitalism and religion were the creation of a competitive, irrational environment that made men evil. The remedy was simply to inculcate a penchant for cooperation and rationality, and to negate selfishness and superstition. This would be accomplished through education and ensured because of the plasticity of children. Children are, without exception, passive and wonderfully contrived compounds, which by due preparation and accurate attention, founded on a correct knowledge of the subject, may be formed collectively into any human character. And although these compounds, like all other works of nature, possess endless varieties, yet they partake of that plastic quality, which by perseverance under judicious management may be ultimately molded into the very image of rational wishes and desires. Ironically, in 1825, the first experiment in modern secular communism took place in the United States, when Robert Owen left Scotland to create a social utopia in New Harmony, Indiana. By 1826, 1 year after the commencement of the community, the preliminary phase was deemed a success, and Owen instituted full communism at New Harmony. However, the optimism was abruptly quelled when official failure was acknowledged 1 year later. Owen's son, Robert Dale Owen, expounds that the reason for its failure was a consequence of the early antisocial circumstances that had surrounded many of the quickly collected inhabitants of New Harmony before their arrival there. It appeared that the members were too various in their feelings and too dissimilar in their habits to govern themselves harmoniously as one community. The great lesson learned by Owen and his followers was that education had to precede the creation of a communist society. For people educated under the old system were too selfish, too uncooperative, and too incorrigible. Henceforth, Owen and his followers would actively promote national public education. It was now adjudged as a prerequisite to the realization of socialism. Although both the Owenites and the Unitarians agreed that the government should assume full control of education, the Owenites' plan was far more radical than anything the Unitarians advocated. The Owenites wanted children to be separated from their parents as early as possible, age 2 was suggested, and placed in district boarding schools away from the influences of the prevailing system. Parents would be limited to visitations and under no circumstances were to interfere with or interrupt the rules of the institution. it was axiomatic that for the attainment of utopia, parents' rights had to be usurped in order to ensure the right character formation of their children. And so, by the 1830s, there were principally two parties that vigorously advocated public education: the Socialists and the Unitarians. The Socialists saw public education as an instrument for the reformation of human character, which was now a prerequisite to the realization of socialism, whereas the Unitarians saw this institution as the means for perfecting man and eradicating evil. Also worth mentioning is that below this tier of influence also contained a large group of religious conservatives and educators who favored government schooling. The religious conservatives were intent on utilizing public education to maintain the predominantly Protestant Anglo-Saxon culture against the rising tide of Catholic emigration. And the educators saw a lucrative centralized market for their textbooks and paraphernalia, occupational security, and better salaries to the concomitant taxes. Four parties with four agendas. Despite all the above, there was extensive opposition to the introduction of government education, and they consisted of entrepreneurs, conservative legislators, taxpayers, and most importantly, those who opposed government infringements on individual freedom. The advocates of a national system of education required a model for their grandiose plans, and they found that model in 19th century Prussia, which was subsequently imported as the underlying design and philosophy of the American public school system. Anyone with a modicum of knowledge of Prussia will know that this state was not a beacon of freedom and liberty for the masses, far from it, and their educational system certainly did not intend to liberate the individual from the thralldom of ignorance. The Prussian Empire was a militaristic monarchy located in what is today northeastern Germany and western Poland. By the 1800s, it emerged as one of the greatest military powers in the world, known for their obedience, diligence, and regimentation, which one can partly ascribe to the philosopher Johann Fichte and the impact of the Napoleonic Wars.
Fichte wrote a series of, it was over a dozen public essays to the Prussian king from, let me say 1808 to about 1818. They're called Addresses to the German Nation. And the provocative event that set the first one off was the Prussian army, which was the Prussian economy, renting soldiers, stealing other people's stuff, had been whipped by Napoleon's amateur army at the Battle of Jena in 1806. And Fichte said it was because this demon imagination was loose among ordinary soldiers, and in situations they would override the orders from headquarters about what to do, and that's why we lost.
Fichte blamed the infiltration of Enlightenment beliefs as the primary reason for the downfall. He called for remedial action through the absolute revision of public schooling. In a word,